Well, I think quality is a word that gets used a lot. It can mean a lot of different things. We can talk about the quality of workmanship, and we're members of the Greater Vancouver Home Builders Association. Jim's a master builder. He's got 30 years of experience, does excellent quality. Some of the other contractors that we would compete with or that you may talk to for a job will also be able to provide a quality job. At the end of the day, if somebody comes in off the street, looks at the job, they'll see quality. But quality means so much more to us. We define quality as the experience of the client. I'm not a salesperson that comes to you, here, buy a kitchen from Briar, and then we disappear. That's not the way we operate. We're actually fully involved in each project right from beginning to end, and we're fully accountable for each project from beginning to end. It's very important that your experience is positive and you say good things about us at the end of the day.
The following recording is brought to you by APQC, your source for benchmarking and best practice research.
What is productivity and what is quality? I mean, you're so familiar with them that you may not remember. Remember the person who said, what is prose? I don't know. I didn't know until recently that I've been speaking it all my life. Same way with process. Process is all the work you do every day. Everything that happens in industry, at home, here in this center, is a process. So how are you going to deal with it? And so is productivity, a process. And I view it, because I'm going to talk about education, as being one of the ways that increases and helps to accomplish productivity and quality. So it's a Mobius strip. I don't know how many of you are familiar with that. You take a strip of paper, you twist it, and you put the two ends together. If you put your hand on any part of that and move it, you will end up back at the same spot. That's the characteristic of a Mobius strip. So you put your hand on education. If you move it and you follow the curve around, you will end up at productivity and back into the education where you started. Education is an investment, because I think it's like in R&D. You make an investment in the future. It's a key component of learning, lifetime learning, employment, international competitiveness, productivity. It helps you to have dividends in health, in cultural literacy, less national R&D, funds for art and music. It is the only thing I can think of that literally leads to an almost universal improvement in whatever you're doing, is to pay attention to productivity. Or another word, if you prefer, is efficiency. The two are almost interchangeable, only a slight difference, but mainly productivity is the same as efficiency. And when you don't have productivity, when you don't have the income flowing, history shows, Carl and I found this in writing the 2-minute warning, there's a famous saying, I think came from the Mongols: when you don't have money, when the trough is empty, horses will bite. Meaning that the nations that are in income inequality, which is a growing percentage of the world, I'll come to that if I have time, to show now we're faced with a world not only flat, but widening polarization of wealth. That can't last long and have a surviving and prosperous world, because they will use different means in order to get it. Now, we want to do it on humanitarian grounds. They may want to decide that isn't fast enough. So we'll come back to that. The U.S. economy is built on mainly services. And services is a conglomeration of all. It's retail store, it's wholesale trade, it's legal services, it's hotels, it's travel, it's health care. It's a conglomeration of those who don't make goods. Goods are things, if you can think, you put on an auto, or a hardware, or a computer. Those are goods. And the goods part is 20%, still very important. But productivity needs to be measured and improved on services, and most of you deal with both. And the others, instruction, mining and drilling, and agriculture. The agriculture used to be almost 100% when we were first formed of American productivity and quality. Everybody was in agriculture. Why do the school systems today work and get 3 months off? To harvest the crops. You needed the kid to go in the fields to help you harvest. We stuck with that concept, and we're paying for it. Because now you have time off, which could be used more productively and are used by most other countries in order to improve whatever they're doing. So you see in the newspapers it fell by X percent. The way that typically measured, when you read that in the paper, productivity rose or fell, what are you looking at? Is this a clicker? If it's a clicker, then pick it up and guess which one that. When you read in the paper about productivity changing, what does it change? And what is it typically measured by? Did you click? GDP growth rate. You're right. Hours worked is a measure of productivity. GDP growth rate is what it typically means when you see it in the paper. So it is important to all of us. Given these economic measures in a hypothetical economy, what is the real GDP growth rate of all those statistics? You have them now in the papers almost daily, what the unemployment rate is, what the inflation rate is. So somebody said, well, what's the rate of productivity in that? It's in there. So what do you think it is of all those numbers? 3%, 6%, 5%, 9, or 8? I don't know whether this is a clicker or not.
It's not a clicker.
Okay, I know the answer, however. It's the sum of productivity and the sum of man hours. So the rate is 3% is the correct answer. You do not use employment. You do not use unemployment. You develop man hours and productivity, which make up the rate of GDP growth. So what is GDP? You've already had this one. It's really typically measured this way, and still is, output over input. No matter whether you're in an educational institution, a hospital, or a government agency, it's output over input. That is a uniform definition of productivity, or efficiency, if you prefer it. If you get to somebody and you meet them and they say, what's our productivity, or what's our efficiency? Efficiency is output, what you get for what you put in. Simple as that. Now, if you want to control inflation, you better be mindful of this, because if you don't control your costs without controlling or adding to productivity, you're going to find pressure. Suppose P is equal to 0, and costs are rising at 8% or 6%. What are you going to get? A rise in prices. You have to survive. If you're in business, you'll raise your prices to cover your costs, right? So therefore, cost plus 0 productivity equals what you have to pay your people, and you have to get it back in the market. Therefore, that's why we pick productivity as an offset. We were trying to tell American leaders, if you have rising costs, the only way to offset those costs is through productivity. Unless you want to get a gift, subsidy, or you want to cheat, you've got to get productivity to offset the cost. And that's still true today, this formula. And you can use as the bottom input. It gets a little complicated now. It's not just labor hours. That's the most commonly one used. Output per labor hour. That's the one that's in the Bureau of Labor Statistics. That's published. But really there's capital investment. And there's also the land underneath it. So you can compute this, but it gets pretty complicated to use land, labor, and capital as the divider. But there are total factor. They call that total factor productivity. And many people will say labor productivity is distorting because it doesn't measure those also, in most cases in the National News or the Bureau of Labor Statistics. But it's accurate enough, in particular to use as a trend, that you can use just labor productivity. And we deal mostly with non-farm business, and not with the others on here as much. Now we do. We have manufacturing firms who are members. We have people that are in other industries, business certainly. But the one that's in the paper on productivity is always non-farm. And that's a big proportion of GDP. So to get GDP, you take the hours worked and assume that it's growing 1% versus the productivity. Let's assume it's 1.5%. That'll give you a 2.5% rise in growth. Growth is what will grow the country's wealth. If GDP doesn't rise, the wealth doesn't rise. That's why this productivity is essential. That we have productivity in order to get growth in the nation. And you'll see that across the world. How much did you grow last year? That's GDP. per capita, usually divided, not just growth in terms of absolute numbers, but divided by the number of people. So here's some examples. If you have productivity of 2.5% and hours of 1.5%, you're going to get a GDP rise of 4%. That is really good. Most nations do not grow at 4%. They don't have one of the two equators up here that add to that. 3, the average growth rate now in the United States and across the world is around 2+%, 2.2 or 2.5. That's about it. You think these are small numbers. That's a huge number difference between 1 and 2, 100%. So it's important to keep productivity numbers in mind when you see them. They will affect your standard of living and your children's standard of living as to what we grow our GDP or not. And the most important component in that is productivity, not just hours worked.
Thank you for listening. For more information on our nonprofit organization, visit APQC online at apqc.org.